our panel. I'll introduce our panel members. So first, Jim Cunningham, Chief People Officer at DEFENSEWERX, and has been an organizational development consultant, HR leader, an industrial organizational psychologist, and professor. He has a PhD in organizational psychology and retired from the United States Air Force as an independent duty medical technician. And next up, Jason Korman, CEO of Gaping Void and a thought leader in the area of adapting change at scale to large organizations. His company helps create more engaged organizations that consistently outperform their competitors by designing a better and more meaningful culture. Stuart Stough, Director at the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center, which leverages the best expertise from industry, other government agencies, and academia to solve the government's toughest scientific and technical problems. And last but not least, Ivan Raiklin, among many roles as a tech scout for the Army's Innovation Command, which focuses on researching cutting-edge technologies in Silicon Valley, who can fill Army technology gaps in artificial intelligence and mixed reality gaming. He has spent over 2 decades in and out of uniform working in the special ops community.
Let's do this.
Right. Okay, so one of the many problems in bringing MDO to reality are the differences in operating cultures across the various domains. So airspace, land, sea, cyber, you can look at those domains and say there are different planning and execution timelines and authorities for each domain, for example, among many other issues. There's also different operating cultures in the various COCOMs, right? So we've got different geographic regions there to deal with. So when cyber teams in Texas are linked up to work real-time with air assets in the Pacific, they need to be able to work together using a common language and operational execution playbook. Another problem we can consider is the gap between the innovation side of the Air Force and the way we've always done it crowd. So the purpose of our panel is to address this issue and say, what can we do, what can the military do to bring different well-established cultures together, creating the right environment for collaboration? So let's just take a few minutes here and talk about the problem for a second. So what is the problem from your experiences in and outside of the military?
Well, I can tell you that the biggest challenge that I've seen really starts with the leadership. You know, a leader oftentimes, what their expectation is, we have a mission, let's get it done. And what we're trying to do is get everybody on board at even the lowest levels to think like a leader, think what the leader's expectations are. And I can tell you that if they know that reason why these decisions are being made and why we're doing these things, it helps them be a little bit more aligned with what the mission set. As you can see in the graphics of the AFWERX, it looks like a Rubik's Cube. Whenever a situation is changed, just like the colors in the Rubik's Cube, you have to make a couple other moves to get it back to where you need it to be. And it's extremely important that the leaders are mindful of how am I communicating and how do my people understand the reasons why we're doing what we're doing.
So to Jim's point, there's rules and there's norms, right? And one of the challenges with the military generally is there's a lot of rules. And one could argue too many rules. And the norms are inconsistent. So we wind up in situations where execution is inconsistent because we don't all agree to the way things should be done, which lives on top of the rules. So fundamentally, what we need to do first is agree to what are the norms that we operate under, and then create a common language across all platforms that allow the execution to happen in an appropriate way. And so all transformation is linguistic, and we need to have first the language that can make this happen. In the absence of that, we're just rearranging the deck chairs. And it's worth saying, if we don't get it right, we're kind of screwed, right? So there is high risk in us not figuring this out, but it's an inherently human problem around fundamentals of communication. And Jim's point about vision is essential, like really understanding why this all matters. You've got to get people motivated to want to do things, but after that, it's really common language around how it's done. So.
Yeah, I agree with both of those statements. I think when I look at the challenge and the problems that are presented within MDO, I think at the end of the day, or the beginning of the day, it's really a people problem. It's really a people issue. One of the things that Jim and I discussed backstage a little bit was, we really focus within the military, even within the Army on my side, but also having done quite a bit of joint and special operations working within the intelligence community, we have to kind of break that mold a little bit to start looking at the challenges, and not only in terms of a leadership and a top-down approach, but also a bottom-up approach, and how we're working with the lower levels, the junior leaders within the military, not only within the Air Force, but DoD writ large, and how we prepare our young leaders and our young airmen, soldiers, Marines, and others to meet the challenge of working in those environments.
So I just want to interject. I think it's actually more fundamental than that. So when we're talking about working cross-functionally, right, it gets down to fundamentals around, are we actually all on the same team or not? Because I see lots of behavior that would lead me to believe that we're not actually on the same team, that people have motivations and bring ego to the table in a way where it's completely counterproductive, right?
And I think that it may even be competing priorities. You may have a mission set and your priority, and it may be counterintuitive to somebody else's priority or some other leader's priority. And if you're going to be multidimensional, you have to figure out what is the long game here. And sometimes it's their siloed competing priorities that impact that.
There is thinking which would be wipe the whole thing clean and start all over, because it might be easy to build something from the ground up than to try to get all these multi-siloed organizations to actually collaborate. But anyway, I don't want to.
So let me just add to that. I think you have a massive cultural divergence, both vertically as well as horizontally. So horizontally, we're talking services. You mentioned COCOMs. That's maybe geographic or functionally based. But in terms of the services, that's probably where the biggest divergence is. Even to this day, even though we have joint special operations or joint commands, we use our different doctrines, TTPs, terminology. I like to call them doctrinal noises, right? One person is going to use one 3-letter acronym to discuss exactly the same thing, which references another 3-letter acronym or 3-letter agency, I guess.
I don't understand anything you just said, by the way.
So on the vertical side, culturally speaking, you have 18-year-olds joining the service, any service, and how do they communicate? They're doing Snapchat, video communications real time with each other, and sometimes delayed, and they consume it when they're available. If you talk to somebody that's a 50, 60-year-old civilian executive, or even a 3 to 4-star general, I think even to this day, most folks that are outside of this innovation ecosystem, whether it's Army, Air Force, it's Navy, et cetera, they probably have never really had substantive interaction using Twitter, using one of these social platforms other than potentially LinkedIn or even Snapchat, right? So I think the big component there is there's big cultural divergence, vertically in age and things like that, but also across the different services. One of the big ways I think we can close that gap is to build infrastructure that allows for seamless communications. A lot of times you can't do that for security reasons, but at least on our unclassified systems, I think we need to implement that technology that today's society writ large is using to be able to understand what the next generation is using to be able to integrate that into our communications flow.
And I think what you said also goes to a point that Jason was making earlier about that this is kind of a new problem, right? That this hasn't always been a problem that we've had, this culture issue. So is that because millennials are paying more attention or they're more sensitive to it? How did we get here, I guess, is the question. What has caused cultural divergence to become a problem?
Well, I think that we're sharing a lot more. Anybody can download a podcast, or they can see something on LinkedIn, and And I think it's just becoming more, we're all becoming more aware of how important things like culture are. And people are becoming educated, and the more educated you get, the more you want to challenge and sort of revolutionize.
So I don't want to put everybody to sleep, but so I'll do the short version of it. So and we deal mostly in enterprise, large organizations, healthcare, higher ed. So this is a view, sort of a macro view of the world. And what we see is that over the last generation, there's a lot of things that have changed. And when we say things, I mean societal function. We're less religious than we've ever been as a country. Families are less conventional than they've ever been. More people living alone. What it's done is a collection of all those things, compounded by, more recently, constant information coming at you, all sorts of distractions, which are mostly not positive on some level. But the collection of these shifts in society and information overload has caused people to look for more in the work they do. More meaning, because they're not finding meaning in the traditional parts of their lives they used to. And they're looking for meaning and connection to purpose in what they do every day. So they don't want to just show up and get paid. They want to show up and do meaningful work and feel like they are developing over time. Doing things that matter for them, matter for society. And so if you look at work from that perspective, then you see that it's become actually less transactional and more about relationships and about meaning and purpose. And so that's why we see, we do quite a bit of work in higher ed. You can sit with 20 students, 30 students in any school across the country, ask them what they want to be doing. Most of them will be, their response will relate in some way to something that will benefit the world from their perspective. Which is kind of nuts, actually, if you think about it. Only because it's very hard to make a living doing that, right? Conceptually, it's like, okay, how does that actually work? How do you pay your rent? But there's this deep desire that people have for meaning and to do work that matters, to more than just their bank account. So,
I think within the military, at least for me, I look at it in maybe a little bit of a different paradigm in terms of kind of the challenge. I think you both really touched on it in terms of how technology has really changed the environment. I think within the military as a whole, we've been somewhat latent in our response to the technology advances that have really come into play and how they fit into a military dynamic. How do they fit into our daily jobs? I think when I look at my son's generation, you mentioned YouTube and a bunch of other social media platforms. They're finding out how to do things from other individuals. I think that same capability exists within the military. We've just been late to the game in how to adapt it. Is there a way to incorporate that from a learning perspective, from a teaching perspective, from an actual operational perspective? I was just looking at a quote a minute ago from Lieutenant General Rick Burr from the Australian military, the Australian Army, and he made a statement in relation to MDO recently, and he said, an organization which always insists on best practices rather than emerging practice is risk of ruin through imposing dogmatic solutions to complex problems. And I think for us, I think that is that's a challenge that we need to be ready to implement. Best practices really no longer work in an environment, especially within a multi-domain environment where things are changing. There's different challenges. We risk, one or more of those domains being threatened at a leadership level or at a high level, to where, again, going back to my previous statement, we really have to push some of that down to the lowest level to ensure a continuity of operations.
So can I just add something to what Stuart said? So one of the fundamental concepts that we work with is this notion that culture is by definition a social construct. And if you look at it from that perspective, and you realize that the way culture spreads and the way culture changes is through social interactions, right? Then you realize that you actually cannot train for culture. Right. What you can train for are the norms that exist now. But then if you want to shift culture, it's about things that will get people to talk about the things you need them to talk about, right? That will talk about how we work together, what the vision is, whatever it might be. There's a long list of things, but that's what creates the norms. So in an environment where we want to train, because that's the military environment, when it comes to culture, you actually need different tools, right? You need tools that drive socialization of new norms, and that's how things shift, is by sharing. And we can look at how this country has shifted, say, in the last few years, and it's been dramatic, right? Whether you like it or not, it is, right? And it's happened not through anybody being trained as to what the new realities are, but through people sharing. Right? So, just want to mention that.
So I don't want to belabor this. I mean, culture is a composite of shared experiences, obviously. And if I'm king for a day, what we can do to essentially move towards a more innovative culture in the Department of Defense space, why not start training using VR and AR and get away from emails? Picture is worth 1,000 words. Video is worth 30,000 words a second. And then a virtual experience is worth exponentially more than 30,000 words a second. So you can convey information in such a manner that can really expedite the transition of, if you want it to be a unified culture or a more disparate culture, at the end of the day, I think using technology in that sense will help expedite it.
I think that's a great segue kind of to the last part of our discussion here, because walking away from the panel, I'd really like to see a solutions framework or some sort of actionable items that say this is what the Department of Defense or the Air Force can do to move the culture forward so that we can enable collaboration across those domains. Maybe we have to break down authorities. Maybe we have to change the playbook. So what is the solution, or what are the solutions that we need to be looking at?
I think I jumped the gun on that one.
Yeah, that's okay. It's a good segment.
So, from our perspective, it's really looking at where does the dysfunction lie, right? Meaning, where are the real blockages in the collaboration that's required to be able to affect the change, right? And so, one of the problems that every large, well, and small, but especially large organization has is that there's lots of elephants in the room, and nobody talks about them. Right? We pretend like they are not there. And so what we need to do is we need tools to go, hey, this is a problem. We all need to get together and talk about it. Because if we don't do that, it will never change. So number one is trying to work through those problems. And then number two is the vision and language for the future. How are we going to work together? What's going to allow us to achieve the vision for the future? How we're going to get more collaborative. So two things.
Well, I'm gonna piggyback a little bit. Yesterday, one of the generals was commenting on how important transparency was, and I think it's great to say we're going to be transparent, but you have to be transparent across the board. You actually have to celebrate transparency and how, it related to possibly a win or a lesson learned. And if you can't have that transparency, that pink elephant will always exist in the room that no one wants to talk about. And, it's a challenge because there are several people that may be uncomfortable with not necessarily themselves being transparent, but maybe subordinates being transparent upward. And how you create the culture, you have to unlearn a lot of things that have gotten you to that place. And think of what has gotten you here might not keep you here. And sort of, that's how you push the envelope.
I agree. I think, I mentioned kind of points of view and paradigm a moment ago as well. I think that really gets into a big piece of how we innovate within the Department of Defense, within the Air Force. And that really gets down to things like recruiting and retention. When we're recruiting, how do we recruit now? Do we change our practices? Do we look at how we retain? Again, probably not something that's very popular to talk about, but in terms of how we meet the challenges of MDO, I said it before, it's a people business. Yes, we have AI. Yes, we have a bunch of solutions that we bring to the party, that we bring to the fight. We have a bunch of providers here that bring a bunch of those solutions. This is also a people business, and we can't lose sight of that. It's a soldier, it's an airman, it's a warfighter business. And if we need to meet the challenges of MDO, recruiting and retention is going to be a huge piece of that. Changing that paradigm, changing that shift in what do we look for? How do we meet the challenges of that, I think are going to be a key component of that, along with the technology, along with the different R&D and S&T approaches that we bring. But at the end of the day, I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that it's people that drive innovation. It's not technology that drives innovation. And if we don't bring the right frame of mind and the right individuals to that war, to that fight, and to the requirements to change, at the end of the day, I think we're going to have a tough road to sled if we don't start making those changes pretty quick.
So I want to comment. I recently saw a shift, and when I read an article that the CIA had a booth at Comic-Con, they were trying to recruit. So that's a shift in thinking, and I was greatly surprised. And I'm not saying that they're addressing their culture with hiring people that would go to Comic-Con, but the reality is, I mean, it's looking at people a lot differently and not just making an assumption of what is the perfect agent going to be. It might be driven by something else, and that's thinking outside of the box.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that. What I wanted to comment, and it's kind of piggyback of what you're saying, it's, I think the core of it is trust, you know? In order to move forward, you got to establish trust. And how do you establish trust? It's through connectedness, through constant communications. Shared experiences are done by constantly engaging with each other so that you understand what the other person's motivations are to do X and what the other side's motivations are to do Y. I think that's whether you want to call it elephant, pink elephant, or maybe yellow elephant in the room.
So how would you propose, given the state of things, to build more trust? Because it's inherently, the system does not inspire trust on almost any level. You know, it's so how do you just sort of?
I think you can start with the physical structure of offices, right? So you look at some of these companies out there, they have a bullpen where you're not in a cubicle, there are no walls to really stop that from occurring.
Right.
You need to set out rules, at least, management needs to set out rules on when you can, essentially, and can't, when it's culturally appropriate to, be on the phone, blaring, and then also interacting with others. That's the physical environment. And then in the digital environment, I know that, who in here is on JWIX, for example? So there's a chat system on JWIX. Well, there isn't a chat system really that's effective globally on CIPRNet that I'm aware of. And there is in some of the SOCOM programs, but writ large there isn't. And then on NIPRNet, a secure sort of chat mechanism isn't in play. So I think you can create a lot of different non-official networks using secure means that are sanctioned by your office that can help facilitate that both in the digital environment and in the physical environment.
So I want to help answer your question. You talked about people, and I think that when we interview and we assess people for jobs, if you want to build a trusting environment, you want to be able to instinctively trust the people you're hiring, so you can empower them to carry out the mission. If you can't trust them, it's hard to empower. Then you create a different culture of maybe even micromanagement, right? And we know that's counterproductive, right? So the important thing is hiring the right people.
So, but from what we've seen, HR functions are broken.
Sure.
Right? The whole, retention problem is a symptom of that. The government invests a huge amount of money educating people, getting them to a certain place, and then they go. So,
Sure.
That's probably driven in part by trust, right? So you've got a series of broken systems, and they all interact with each other to create this sense of lack of control, of lack of trust, of just poor functioning. And so we've got to recreate those norms around how people look at each other and how they connect to get the work done. And that to your original point, yes, it's a lot about leadership, and it's a lot about having the right rules in place, because God knows there's a lot of bad rules.
Right. Yeah, and I don't equal leadership to rules either.
Right.
It's more about values and driving and aligning the teams when I look at leadership.
So how do we spread that through an organization as large as the Department of Defense? How do we make that change?
You
at that level?
redesign a system of beliefs that drives the behaviors and the outcomes you want to have. It's beliefs, mindsets, principles. The psychology of how we do our work drives behavior, and the behaviors give you your outcomes. So you start at the beginning. You start with the beliefs that we have, that we show up with every day, which is one of the problems why we have some of the societal problems that we do right now, is because we all believe different things, right? There's no clear agreement what it means to be American, and there's no, like when I was a kid, a lot of that stuff was very straightforward. So you got lots of people, you got all this information coming from different places, people believe different things, no one's clear on much, they know they got to show up and follow the rules. So you got to start with new beliefs, which will give you, and new mindsets and new principles, and then that's what drives the behaviors to get your outcomes. That's how you redesign it, from our perspective. So.
I think there's a necessity to really focus on rapid change. I think, again, from my perspective, I think top-down is very important. We need to engage the lower levels. It has to start occurring very quickly. It's great to have panels. It's great to talk about it. The necessity really comes in action. And I think we have to become action-oriented to the challenges and the threats that are being posed to our nation, that the Department of Defense and the Air Force are responsible for responding to. So if we don't start with a necessity for change at a people level, that really drives that innovation, that drives the necessity to meet all of the requirements, all of the threats that we're facing. Again, we're going to be a day late and a dollar short if we don't start this very quickly in a more, concerted effort to address it across the board.
I guess the question is, do we want to strive for mediocrity in second place? Or do we want to maintain our primacy, essentially, as the world's most influential, powerful national security apparatus? And I think we're being threatened, obviously, in the artificial intelligence space for numerous reasons. We don't have time to go into those. That's kind of my baby. With China, Europe's got an AI policy that they're moving forward with, as well as Russia. So do we want to maintain our primacy, or do we want to relegate ourselves to mediocrity? I choose the former.
That's the motivation for it all. That's the vision. That is why we should be showing up every day, everybody. Right?
And that makes it a priority as well, right?
Yeah, and as Chris Klug over at Edwards said to me, there will be another. What was it exactly he said? There'll be another Pearl Harbor, and this time we may not come back from it. And so anybody who believes that will show up every day, right, giving their all. So we need to get that, and then we need the beliefs and mindsets that will drive that change. And it's got to be a priority for everyone.
And on that note, we're going to conclude our panel. So thank you to the four of you for all of your insightful advice here. Okay.